Hi, I'm Jay Bloom at work at Ergonautically, and I'm going to do a series of podcasts on platform design, platform thinking. And my first guest in that series is my good friend Spencer Pittman. Spencer, why don't you introduce yourself to everybody?
Yeah, I'm Spencer Pittman, currently a senior engineering manager for Singularity 6. We're a pre launch video game startup. We're building an MMO called Palia that there's a launch trailer out for. Otherwise, pretty like secret sauce. But I'm new to video games. My background is more in enterprise operations, platform design. I focus more on the organization design side of Conway's Law than the technology side, though it's, in my experience, impossible to avoid both. So I tend to lean in on enterprise and operational architectures. So it's been really cool to bring that to a space like video games because as that industry sort of has shifted more online, more multi-tenant, a lot of the lessons that like manufacturing and web services have had to learn are things that video games are grappling with. And there's a lot of new edge cases too because you need like clickable persistence and art and like shader algorithms to run, and so there's like all these kind of new to me at least things that are like brought into a space that I thought I sort of understood. So.
Yeah. I think, like I was reading this weekend, it was interesting. I was reading about kind of the history of Slack, and the fact that Slack started out as an in-game chat system
Right.
for a game that itself failed, but the chat system obviously became massively. Actually, I should correct that. It's not. It wasn't an in-game. It was a replacement for their internal IRC
Yeah.
channels. But so interesting to kind of think about how such small functions end up being quite large endeavors at a certain scale.
Yeah. I think that's like the conversation that I'm really encountering in the industry a lot is there are these things that are maybe assumed to be straightforward to implement because maybe in a certain type of game they are, right? Like if single player, single tenant, not online game, some function might be straightforward, like hit points or something like that. But when you hit, you know, many users on distributed architectures and, backend platforms have become more complex. But even more as you go into like massively multiplayer open world games and stuff, something like a hit point system that feels like straightforward, you might, if you were building a game yourself, you could probably just write it as some like very simple database call. It's going to be pretty complex. And I think like what we're grappling with that I think you and I have talked about before is like that complexity is not just technical, it's not just architectural.
Yeah.
It also requires like the organization to build different muscles and literally different designs
Yep.
to accommodate that because what works in it seems like video games really like have been positively impacted by something like Scrum specifically or Agile more broadly because it's a nice departure from the waterfall. This thing goes in a box. We can't touch it after it hits the box. Like it hits shelves, and we hope it's really good, right? It's
Yep.
like
Yep.
now games are mostly digitally distributed. They're distributed on a lot of different platforms. There's a lot of opportunity to upgrade them. There's a lot of opportunity to test them before they hit the like box moment.
Yep.
And many games are really consumed as like live services. So players are really used to like having the game experience and game world extended, having like features added and stuff, and even in some cases like mechanics added and changed. And they don't always receive that well. There's this game that like I play sometimes called Sea of Thieves, and it's funny because every like season they will change mechanics, and I'm not good enough at it to like really be impacted by this stuff. But like other people are like, oh my gosh, they changed the cannonballs, and now I can't do whatever strategy. So there's these like interesting relationships that have emerged where like they're more active, ongoing, what you would recognize as just like continuous improvement and continuous relationship with the customer, service design, right? But for video games, that stuff is not necessarily intuitive. And so when we think about that reality, the organization design conversation is really front and center in a way that like felt like it had kind of become old hat. You know, like we've worked with some like insurance companies and stuff like that, and you know, it's funny because you don't think of those as like particularly innovative, but you'll talk to a CTO who's like, yeah, theory of constraints, and you know, like should we be choosing like Scrum or Kanban? And you're like, okay, cool. Okay. Yep. And like in this industry, you're framing those conversations in a different way. In some ways, it's like harder because they don't have like the manufacturing touch points, or the like the way that the industry's changed is a lot different than you know, insurance as an example, right? Like it's not just, hey, we're adding in software delivery to a core product that feels the same for the end user. It's like, no, literally everything about it's a lot more tantamount to how like, you know, Windows and Microsoft have had to change their thinking than, you know, an insurance company. So
yeah, interesting. Yeah. I want to like poke at one thing that I think is kind of super interesting to me. Like, so I like, you know, the shrink wrapped games, the single player games back, you know, from when we were kids, or at least from when I was a kid. You know, I used to buy them on cassette tape, so I'm very old. Anyway, those to me feel like a product, right? Like the fitness of the design has to do with an individual consumer having an experience pretty much by themselves, maybe with a couple friends, maybe with like, you know, a 2-up or something like that. But really, like, it's mostly individuals. And then, you know, we move kind of from there up to, you know, a middle range of kind of like how things are connected. So like you can think of the web as being lots of single person sessions, but with opportunities to interact with other people, time delayed, right? Like not quite real time. But then you get to these games, like I'm thinking about like Diablo that just is about to be released, or any of these other games where it's service design, right? It's not product design anymore. It's service design, and part of the way you know it's service design is because these live service games, they die if there's not people involved. Like if the people don't show up, they just don't work. So to me, like that service design thing is something about like co-creation of the experience. Like the gaming group needs to be thinking of how to create an experience that makes it more likely that other players will interact. Like it's a whole separate set of problems, right?
So yeah, absolutely. It's funny because I think that's probably the big conceptual leap. And this isn't restricted to, I mean, I remember working with this, like one of the largest manufacturing firms in the world. And I was brought in under the guise of like, hey, we have all of this, like basically database issues, and we like want to go full in on microservice architecture because we need composability and blah, blah, blah. Right. And it was funny because as you know, like those starting points wind up being sort of random, and the work that you wind up doing is actually more like first of all, what we actually wound up with was a thoughtful, context-sensitive set of choices where there was some microservices and, a series of like pub sub systems, and then some monoliths, right?
Yep.
And some like macro service roll-ups that technically had like internal microservice orchestration, but like, we're only experienced as like a single interface, and that, it's wacky, but this is like enterprise software, right? But the real evolution in that organization was putting down thinking and working in like, they went from single manufacturing line, very acquisitive company. So all of a sudden it was 40 manufacturing lines globally. And they're like, how do we make these all work together, to a thing where they're thinking about like every business unit as like a service offering, or a catalog of service offerings, right? Yep. And that really required, I think, kind of like what you're talking about, which is what the games industry is going through, which is like, hey, I actually can't, this isn't something I foist upon you and you experience it the way that you experience a movie, right? Like, you're watching a film, you can wonder, but you won't ever know what's happening just outside the frame, right? Yep. A video game, you don't just like have the ability to find out what's going on just outside the frame, but you have the ability to impact it and impact what's going on inside the frame. And so like that to your point, that's like a service. And it requires that like we engage in target experiences in a really proactive and co-creative way. So it's easy to think about that in like abuse cases. The big issue in the industry, right? Because like a lot of games, and Essex, I think, falls into this category, really want like a fun, inclusive experience. But there's a number of people out there who want to troll and show up and grief things. And then there's even like, I think, more middle ground where it's just like cultural differences. Like maybe you want to show up and you're like a min-maxer and you want to like really highlight something, but that can negatively impact a more cozy type of player. Yep. And so like, if we just think about our offerings as products and organize our teams and our like strategy conception as like, you might think of making a bet or something and like, oh, let's go put this out there. But in service design, you're constantly having to get real with like what the experience is and coax it into directions, right? And so like Dave's sort of Dave Snowden's like complex systems are dispositional and you can guide them, is like a relevant sort of mental model, because that's what you wind up having to do, right? If you're talking about a situation where you have, 1 million people with 1 million different versions of the experience, like you can't actually tune every single one to be that perfect little thing. There's some stuff that you can control, like cinematics, right? But those are sort of immersion breaking. Yeah. So we have to find ways to not just build and offer things, but to continually understand the way people are experiencing stuff and be able to respond to it. So in some ways, I actually think that decays the speediness of Scrum. Like if you think about like shipping a box game, like Scrum is really revolutionary because it's like, oh my gosh, like, I mean, it's the classic like early agile versus waterfall thing. Yep. But all of a sudden in a live service, like to the second persistence context, like 2-week iterations may be quite slow, right? Like we need to have a situation where like our whole system is oriented in like a customer service stance. And so the teams that you design and the tools that you build to unlock that are a lot different than, I think, just, writing OKRs and trunk-based development. It looks a lot more like sensitive, empathetic interactions with human beings.
Yeah, I mean, it's, it because like, so I'm thinking about like, in games we have all sorts of like subsystems, right? So we might have an economic subsystem for trading items. We might have a crafting system. We have a combat system. We have a chat system. Like, there's all these different parts of the game that any one player might not interact with any of those. Like, I might not choose to do any crafting. I may not choose to use the text messaging system as all, but I can kind of craft or create my own experience out of these parts that are being offered. And then at a kind of like a more macro level, the game will only balance if we get players that are willing to kind of interact with each other. And so with it, that kind of like network of different interactions and being kind of dynamically put together by the players, seems like it would impact the way that the teams would be structured. Because I assume, the chat system has to be able to like hand you off to the trading system, things like that.
Okay, so I'm gonna do a thing that might make Jeff Sutherland mad, and I apologize in advance. But I think, I mean, you've come across these people who I think somewhat fairly point out that, like, if you're not going to do all of Scrum, you're not going to get the value. And it's funny because I often think of Scrum as like a set of game rules, and it makes it a little more fun to engage with if you're in a Scrum context. But I think it's one of the deficiencies of it is that, like, you have to engage in the whole thing or you don't get the experience. Yep. Now you might argue that it's actually a work system and that's appropriate. Whatever. My point isn't like don't do Scrum, it sucks. It's just that, like, it's designed as a total system of like interactions, right?
Yep.
That's just not something that you can do in a video game system, right? To your point, like, we have to create a system in which, like, one of the things that makes EVE Online inaccessible is that it's like Scrum, except it's like 10 times more complex. And it's cool. I like watching videos of people playing EVE, but I'm not like, oh yeah, let me jump in and like do spreadsheet management as a video game, right? Like, I think it's cool that the people who like it, but it's just too much to me, right? I want the, like, can I just be a pilot of one of the ships? Yeah. And so I think most games that are like designed, like Fortnite, have done a really good job of this, or where, they're saying, cool, like, you can go in and do the one, battle royale mode, but we also want to accommodate like a lot of different ways of playing. So you can show up and be creative, or you can show up and not have to do any building or whatever. And they've gotten to that over time, but I think any like community sim game or like life sim game, if you want to be cozy, you have to create these systems such that, like, the experience itself is composable.
Yep.
I think any time that you like require pass offs between your economic system and your chat system and like all of these things, you're creating a barrier to entry for the player that's it's tougher. Now, some of that has to happen, right? But if you say, like, chat is a really interesting thing because a lot of games that are multiplayer have in-game chat systems. Some people use those. Some people just get on Discord. Some people, my brothers and I play a game online sometimes, and we literally just call each other, the three of us, because it's just a little easier. Yep. So, like, you want those games to be able to still function or still have like a fun loop without that. Yep. What that means, like, in terms of org design, is that, like, your teams have to interoperate without being codependent. So it's like that classic sort of microservices, like high alignment, loose coupling. Yep. Yep. And anytime we have like team coupling that is really tight, we have to ask, like, is this game breaking? Is this system breaking? And
so interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry.
My computer's talking to me. Just one second. Sorry. There we go.
No, no.
Yeah. So I like when you're talking, it made me think of this thing, right? Which I think is kind of shaping a little bit about what, in my mind at least, what you're saying, right? Like, so I think most people think of like Conway's law. So just really quick, people who don't know Conway's law, Conway says that your architecture will reflect the communication pattern that created it. So if you've got teams structured in one way, you should expect the architecture to reflect the structure of the teams. And if the teams communicate in specific ways, you should expect the architecture to communicate in the same way across submodules. So that tends to be like a, and there's the reverse Conway that basically says if you want to change your architecture, you have to change your team structure, or if you want to change your team structure, you have to change your architecture, all that kind of interesting stuff. But I think one of the things that with this platform idea and this game idea is that part of what's driving the communication structure is the customers and the way the customers want to co-create the platform, right? Like, so it's not like you can think of like, again, me sitting alone at home playing Zork, text-based game in case you don't know, and watch out for the Gru. Anyway, is one experience, right? And a single person or single team could create that experience for me because there's no other interactions. But as we kind of move up these kind of stacks of complexity, it's not just that the team structures have to change to kind of reflect the architecture. It's that the architecture and the team structure have to reflect the way that the customers want to be able to dynamically assemble an experience. Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny because there's this piece of John Boyd language that I really like, right? And he's talking about a smaller loop.
Yep.
But unfolding interactions with the environment. And I think that actually is like really nice platform language.
Yep.
And it's something that I think video games have to think about, because one of the things I think differentiates a platform from a product is that like a product, you're kind of worried when people get outside of the target experience, right?
Yep.
And so like, a lot of times platforms are composed of products. And again, in like abuse cases in video games, you got to be worried if people are like using your chat system poorly to curse each other out or do illegal things or something, right? But the game itself is a sort of platform for this like unfolding interaction. And I think open world games and massively multiplayer games are really good examples of this, because like what you want, it's actually like a platform for, I don't know, community and fun. And a good indication that you've built something good is that people are having like surprising experiences of joy, right? Mm-hmm. Like, and if you built some single player game that's more producty, maybe you're upset when people go in and figure out how to like rocket jump over the wall and get more points or something. That's a spoof. In like these big MMOs, like when people are doing surprising things, if they're like, yeah, this is cool. I don't know, like we made parties and we started doing like Fortnite has like a ton of examples of this, just because there's a really big community of people, and they're not like exploiting the game necessarily. They're just saying, hey, yeah, this is a battle royale server. You want us all to die, but we're doing a political rally in it or something like that, and I think they've done a really good job being like, oh, that's interesting. How can we actually accommodate that, right? And platform it, as in like make sure that the platform's not preventing those things. And so again, it's that service design, platform design thing where like when people show up and have surprising experiences that are positive, especially, or they're creating value on your behalf or on the behalf of their community, you have to lean into that and ask like, ooh, is this something that like we should create more opportunities for? Should we oxygenate this? Obviously, the negative version, you should consider starving, adding more controls or prevention techniques. But I think that's a cool relationship that reminds me a lot of like the way that we talked about platforms in manufacturing, or the way that we talked about them in aerospace, right? Like model-based systems engineering is something I spent a lot of time helping install in some big aerospace companies, right? And one of the things that you talk about, especially in the early stage, is like, hey, by creating a set of tools and a set of environments people can sort of like play in, we hope that we're stimulating opportunity for like low cost, high novelty play and design, right? And all of a sudden what we want is for like there to be a safe space for an intern to be like, well, what if we flip the wings around, right? In conventional aerospace design, too costly, too time consuming. But if somebody can just kind of go do that, and mess around with it and be like, hey, look, I put this through a virtual wind tunnel and it actually was really great. All of a sudden the organization can lean into that. And that's like, obviously got economic incentives in that format, but like the way that you pay attention to that and the relationship that you build with the people standing on top of the platform and how you manage the platform itself, I think are really similar. I think there's a lot of like, it's funny because I think you and I have talked about this in more serious business contexts, like, and it's funny because I think it applies in games. It's like sort of obvious for people, but it's like, no, the good thing is people playing and people messing around and people like having some space to fiddle. Right. And these are things that feel obvious to people who maybe work in creative domains, whether that's writing code or like doing art, like an artist, a character designer doesn't like start with the design in their head and then just put it into Maya, right? They play around. They're like, like, what about this shape or this color or whatever, right? And then even afterwards, they're optimizing for the technical impact of their choices and stuff. So like that sort of playfulness is obvious, I think, to maybe somebody who sits in that realm. But we also want that, one, for the players, two, for like people in basically every domain. I even think that like HR and legal, there's like cases for that. Now, obviously the blast radius is bigger and the impacts are significant, but I still think it's like, I find myself wondering how like you can create space for play even in those domains, because your community may need you to rethink like end user license agreements or how you support growth in your team or whatever, right? Like and I've sort of gotten far afield of the original question, but to me the core idea that like a platform is something that like you're inviting people to play around with your core products and be creative is like eminently true, whether you're in a manufacturing context, whether you're in aerospace or insurance or banking or video games. And it's like, for some reason we get into these like, I read the SRE book and a platform's supposed to like look and work like this. And I watched Andrew's presentation the other day where he observed like hell is other people's platforms. And it's funny because it is, and I think it is in a way that like, in the context of this, it's like, it just kind of sucks to take this set of marching orders that somebody else probably built through like fun experimentation and be like, oh no, like Google's SRE guidelines, I'm going to like implement them over here.
Right.
And it's like starting with the end, and it's like actually the process of getting there was really the part that was probably fun.
Yeah.
And also like creative value. 'Cause I don't know, Google SRE may work really well over there. It's definitely not going to be the thing that works for you. So.
Yeah, I mean, like, I sometimes I think about, to the last point, I think about, like, the standards book for jazz, right? Like, anybody can pick up the standards book in theory and play jazz in theory. because the instructions are written down in there. On the other hand, there's being good kind of session player, which means you can kind of adapt to other people's styles really quickly. And then there's like being a tight trio or a tight quartet where you, like you're saying, you've played with the exact same pieces that everybody else is playing, but you've played them together well enough to like play off each other and do the right kind of interactions to make it renewed and interesting for an audience, right? So like, yeah, that practice component it seems to be the thing that's missing often when people get like, I have a recipe, I just have to implement the recipe. Well, I mean, have you cooked potatoes before? Have you cooked fish before? That type of stuff. I think it's interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So there's like two pieces of this that I want to pull on. One is like the layering of platforms, and two is this idea of like. It's probably social practice theory or something, but like there's this incredible thing that happens when you are with a group of people and you kind of cross some Rubicon that, I don't know, maybe you could point to the specifics of it, but like I know the feeling when you're like, it's not even about like getting good at the game. It's like getting good at each other. Yeah. Right. And like my brothers and I are not good together at this game, but we're good at playing with each other, and there's just like this fun because we have like a shorthand language. We have like a thing where essentially like we will have a goal and we'll just kind of get to it because we have like intuition about one another and what we're doing, and like one brother likes to do this and the other brother likes to do that, and that there's just like a sense of joy in that. And it actually does result in quite a bit more proficiency as a group in the game. We're probably not winning tournaments, but like we occasionally do better than we normally do, and that's really cool.
Yep.
The other part that I was talking about is like I think that is true. Actually, I think Andrew observed this in that same talk I'm talking about, but it's like we used to like pick apart like, well, your platform's here and the software's here and the infrastructure's here. And the truth is like, you can argue that like you have these layered platforms, right? And Stuart Brand talks about it, I think, is like pace layers are changing differently. Like the geologic pace layer and then the technological and the fashion pace layer and stuff. But like, I don't think we're relieved from like we get to play as players, but then I think we also, at least in a company, have the responsibility to provide a platform at the level above us, right? And so, we are like any software company where I think you could argue there's like a infrastructure layer, we're cloud-based. I don't think that's surprising anymore. So like there's a metal layer that's provided to us, right? We consume that platform, but we build on it at layers above ourselves. Yeah. And I think like any company who's in that space, like we have this unfortunate way of describing this stuff where it's like, well, that's the platform team. And so they do the platform and then, they have interaction modes or whatever, like other people like play on it. And these guys build the apps and they build the software. But like, I don't think most software is actually consumed that way anymore. I mean, maybe really specific consumer software. Like I don't know much about, I like don't use a ton of social media these days, but like even something like Twitter is a platform, right? Like it's a set of tools. I don't use Twitter DMs really, right? Like I use, and I actually try not to really use Twitter at all these days, but Twitter and its like last great iteration was still a thing where like the way I played with Twitter is quite different than, I don't know, people in other sub communities of it, right? Yep. How much more something like, I don't know, Jira, which I have a lot of comments about, but many options for how you can use that tool depending on your organization, but it's not actually a single tool, right? It's this array of features that are themselves probably under the hood, like entire services, whether those are monolithic or microservices, who knows or cares. But this reality is like, we show up to this thing, it should unlock creativity and unlock play for us. Even while we're using it to provide the same thing to some other
Sure. Yep.
set of things above us or beside us or whatever, you know.
Yeah.
I tend to be vertical in my thinking, but yeah, so anyway, I don't know. It's a little philosophical,
I think,
but
one of the things I was thinking about is just I'm like staying with the game metaphor because I like it. Like, I mean, hopefully people are following along. We're kind of using the game metaphor to talk about things that might happen inside of an organization that has an internal platform as much as an external platform, right? Like, we're kind of, I think, using a metaphor to say like your developers are kind of like game players in that they're trying to dynamically assemble from a set of tools and interactions with each other, emergent, applications or whatever we want to call it. So I was thinking like when you play a game, right? When you play any of these larger games, like one of the first things you get is a tutorial on the basic mechanics, right? Like, and it's interesting because you don't usually get a tutorial on like how to be friends with people or how to like build a community. You get taught like this is how you reload the weapon, this is how to, like the mechanics so that you have the basic skills with the tools. And then it's kind of assumed that you're going to figure out how to do the rest of the emergent stuff, right?
yeah, so it's funny because I've been having a lot of conversations with people both inside and outside of our company about this, which is like one of my complaints about a series of our like industry software, things that you and I encounter a lot is that like to get the base level value out of them, it requires lots and lots of hours to play with it. And like, I think that that's a big miss. This makes sense for like, a software programming language or something that like is designed to support craft and like deep construction. But a lot of these like support tools, really what people want, they're like, it's not my job to like write docs like as a art form. I just want a thing that just contains and shares my documents and like lets me kind of flow through this writing. Yep. But in order to like write a doc, I have to like learn some friggin' markdown specialist language that's also half ASCII doc, and then I need to like learn some like updating flow, and it's like, of course it doesn't just sit on your Git flow or whatever. And I think that's like a good example of like a failure mode for like platform offerings. Because the truth is like good video games are designed in such a way that like, they introduce you to the basic controls and those like building blocks that like give you the fundamentals, but like the experience of just playing the game, again, to go back to Boyd, you have this unfolding interaction with the environment where you have like this cumulative development. I think Dungeons and Dragons, not a video game, but like a very well-designed version of this. Like you have a DM who maybe walks you through the basics of character creation and basic mechanics, but it's really through like playing with a kind party that's like brings you along. You discover all of these things. So like, I prefer to play a rogue in D&D, and when I first started, I was like, cool, I can sneak and like sneak attack and all this stuff. And now I've gotten to the point where there's all of these kind of like stackable things that you compose through like making your rogue interact with either mechanics that you wholly own or other mechanics in your party that are cool. And a lot of them are pure role playing. They're not even like battle aspects, and you can like, you and your artificer or whatever can like talk your way out of a complex situation because you just get some, how you're going to be able to stack your rolls and stuff. Yeah. And I think again, like that's a really joyful experience because you feel like you've discovered something, and in many ways you have. Like, maybe in the case of D&D, there's enough people playing it that somebody on a forum somewhere is probably going to describe that. But like, I think one of the things that's really cool that you see in a company is like you have these rules or these mechanics or these systems that like people figure out how to use to their advantage. And we talk about this a lot in terms of people spamming to kind of like ill effect, but I think, sort of thinking the best of people, like if you have good purposeful organization and you're supporting that kind of play, like people should be using your internal platforms in ways that surprise you, right? Like, hey, Jabe's, Artificer's CTO stuff combined with my, roguish use of doc things to like build a really nice, whatever, I don't know, extending the metaphor too far, but, yeah, and I think instead we sort of turn our brains off, right? Like we look at it as like, well, there's this policy flow and we've thought of everything and we've defined it in this way, but like we want the value proposition of, complexity, which is guided and maybe guardrailed, but ultimately has some variation in it. And instead we apply these like highly constrained modes of interaction that we've stolen from somebody else's platform book or whatever. And, it's like, yeah, you do need to constrain like real downsides, but I think that people should feel like they have the space to play around with stuff. Yeah. Right. And, one of the coolest things that I've seen as a technologist is you look at something like Kubernetes and containers more generally. And, once people sort of cross over to like getting the reason those tools are useful, all of a sudden they start doing stuff that like maybe wouldn't even be like professionally implemented or implemented at scale. But you're like, oh, cool. You're like adjusting your workflow to like leverage this value proposition in a way that like I wouldn't know to tell you to do that because like I don't hold your workflow, right? Yep. And I think that's what we should expect of platforms. I think we often don't even talk about, Yeah,
and I'm thinking also like, because we were talking about kind of composability and co-creation and stuff like that. But, like, again, going back to the silly shooting game that all the children play. Fortnite, that's the one.
We're old, man.
Yeah, I know. But I can't. Fortnite, I cannot play. I cannot understand what's happening.
Yeah.
It's just I'm instantly dead. But what I was going to say about it is that like, they're like the like guns only no building or building only no guns, and then the different types of matches, right? It is like an opinionated configuration of the system, right? So like I want to be constrained in a particular way to only be, I don't want to have to deal with the building parts of this. I just want to be able to play the gunplay parts of the game. Or I don't want to deal with a competitive situation. I just want to deal with the building aspects of it. And not necessarily just as like a starting point, but maybe that's the only thing they ever want to do with the game, right? Because even in the game itself, the kind of ranking system is progressive. So it's not just like beginner work. It's actually like constrained experience. And I'm kind of thinking about that in relationship to like opinionated platforms, right? Like an opinionated, like, the Heroku version of a platform where it's like, I actually just don't care about most of this. I just want to hit a button. I want you to give me my pre-configured platform. And then I'm going to start working. Maybe some parts of the organization really value that. Maybe other parts of the organization want to be able to take it apart and tinker it with it differently and have reasons to do that. So, I was wondering if you had any thoughts about like lowering the barrier to entry, or like having custom configurations of different components to lower the load at different parts of the organization.
It's funny because I think there's a lot of ways to cut at this. I think you're seeing it with like companies doing templatable, like user generated, or it's like, and whatever. You see this a lot with like the way people template up pods and Kubernetes and stuff like that. But like that requires somebody who knows how to build the templates. In a document management system, that may be a lot easier than in technology infrastructure. But in either situation, it requires somebody who's like recognizing, first of all, seeing the like, oh, hey, there's a lot of people who are just playing like a build thing. And the thing that sucks about some of those is in a situation where it's like that, where it's basically everybody has to get in and take a non-adversarial approach to a game that's designed to be adversarial. That's like a pretty massive, like you just need so much scale to have that kind of edge case emerge to even know if it's something to support. I think that's like a danger. Again, sort of talking about service design, like your sensory mechanisms for understanding how people are using this and whether those experiences are positive or negative or like worth backstopping can be really tough, especially without a lot of scale. I think what I've seen that's kind of interesting. So I recently started using Confluence for docs, and I hadn't used that in a really long time. The last time I remembered using it, I think we had it like backed up on Git, and it was basically just like a markdown machine. But Confluence now provides a lot of like, I think fairly thoughtful templates that you can start with for like, I don't know, you start with a new team, and I've used Notion a lot, and it has a lot of these same offerings. And I think the thing that's sort of interesting to me about that is like, they've obviously they've seen enough use cases, or they've like looked outside of their domain and been like, okay, hey, if you have a Scrum team, here's your like getting started template. And there's some of those things that like I'll populate the template just to see what it is because I don't really know. And then there's some things where it's like, we're like set you up to like use Kanban, and I'm like, this is fucking not right. And like, but that's again like the value. I think about this a lot because I'm like, well, if you'd never like run into that, and your baseline was going to be some like PMP PMBOK type. I'm gonna just get everybody mad at me today. But like whatever, like this super top down, highly instrumented thing, and you're like, well, like Kanban, can I play with that? Right. I think that's like a really, really cool thing, even if eventually you'd have Jay Bloom come in and be like, okay, let's talk about real Kanban, right? I think creating the space for like reversible play is really, really an important part of this. And so like opinions are good, and especially if like it's costly to support edge cases for your platform, you want to be careful about like what opinions you backstop. Same thing with abuse cases. Like if you're building a Kanban tool, you probably don't want to like have people leveraging it for PMBOK stuff, or like create a lot of counterforcing functions just because like it's not going to do a good job of that, right? Like it's okay to take these sort of like, pseudo moral positions. I think even in stuff like serverless, like there's been this thing the last couple of days where like what was it? Oh, Amazon Prime Video has like switched off of like a Lambda and AWS step functions like serverless architecture to a monolith because it reduced their compute costs a lot, right? And I think it seems like one of the misses of the serverless offering has been that like, and maybe they didn't know, but it's not like clearly articulated like, hey, this is some like scale appropriateness. And of course, because it's the internet, people are like, see, serverless and microservices are wrong and dumb, and like my morality wins, and like that's obviously not the lesson, right? The lesson is like, hey, appropriate methods for appropriate context. But I think that it's really important for the platform to, as much as it's able, to give one reversible options for play, right? Like, so step in and play with this template, but also like guidance on what the guardrails are. So, hey, serverless and step functions are a really good way to bootstrap a thing. What we've learned, because we're Amazon, is that like your cost inflection point is going to come at about this place or whatever, because, a startup like us might be like, okay, cool. Like we really want this thing, and we really don't want to like the cost of designing and offering it as a microservice for us now may be way too high. We can afford some like orchestration overhead, but like when should we prepare for like a refactor? Like what SLI or what SLI should we be looking at to know that like, ooh, crud, the future is here, like trigger a refactor, right?
Yeah.
And I think that like I'm picking on Amazon. I actually think that generally my experience with AWS is they're pretty good at this. But again, like you're just going to learn these edge cases in your platform, and so I think being opinionated is good, but also giving people tools to understand nuances in your opinion and situate themselves within it is like a magical thing. Because should I be able to play with serverless to get to ship what I want to ship? Yeah, absolutely. Should I be careful about things that I don't know? If I'm like, I mean, if I've never run an enterprise scale application and I'm like, man, this is classic, like this runs really great on my machine, but like I don't know what I don't know. And so I think really, really ethical, responsible platforms are helping people think, bigger, broader, think about things that they don't know so that they can understand the consequences of converging on a solution now. And I think ideally like creating reversibility, right? Like I saw this recently about actually a GCP thing where they're building a set of data migration tools that have to do with like scale. And I don't remember exactly what the specifics were, but I was like, that's really awesome and really smart for them as a business, right? Because like conceivably it could happen that I don't know, like whatever architecture you pick, instead of getting mad that like the specific technology choice you've made isn't working, you just hate GCP and just go over to AWS, right? And like, I don't know if that would really happen, but I don't know, man. I mean, I know people who've switched their banks because the login breaks too much, right? Like, and so I think it's wise to recognize that like there are limits on a lot of use cases and make it easy to, again, sort of move laterally and play differently to as your context changes to still maintain connection to the platform. Maybe you're a Fortnite player who starts out loving the intensity of the battle royale, and then you have a kid like I do, and like, man, I just can't handle the emotional context of games like that. And so like I tend to play things that are just calming. So if you can keep me in the Fortnite loop by offering other things, what a better experience than requiring me to go to depart.
So I have one last question for you. The way I try to think of this sometimes is like, right now, a lot of the platform engineering conversation has like a developer supremacy, developer focus to it, right? And so to me, I always imagine it as we've got a team of developers looking at a platform, right? They look, and the value stream language really enforces this too, right? Like it's a pipe to production, like it's a one-way view, right? Mm-hmm. So you're helping build some platforms and working with platform teams, and I think when I'm in the platform team, when I look out, I see like a bunch of teams. There's not just one thing. I've got a like heterogeneous set of people who want to work in different kinds of ways and stuff like this, but also like to what extent is the platform team kind of responsible for creating conditions where the teams can interact with each other appropriately? Because I think these are different, like these are completely different problems than Scrum thinks about or traditional product management thinks about, right? The interaction between teams, creating a space for that to happen, and then like adding the operations components into the questions. That's the kind of looking up version.
So it's funny because I feel like I've learned this lesson in a couple of different ways, but there's like we have this set of personas, right? And these personas have their journeys and they have their like needs and wants, and we have like little pictures of them and maybe we name them or whatever, right? Like kind of the 2009 version of UX research. Yep. And, as long as we're like making things good for those personas, whatever. Video games pointedly don't let you do that because people are so often like in interaction with each other and their experiences like explode one another's experiences, right? I mean, everybody who plays online games has like experienced or at least been in proximity to like griefing and stuff like that, right? Cool. So I think this is one of the ways that like video games have intuition that are more sophisticated than the rest of us in the software I'm extending me to everybody else, but like, certainly than I did, which is like, oh, it's not just like the persona and how they vertically like sit on your thing, but it's how they like touch other people in it, right? And like, does Trello have to worry about how you're using your board impacts me? Probably in most cases not, but like, I think in a company, once you like step into the realm, like, yeah, teams impact each other massively, right? Like we randomize one another all the time, like especially in the reality of like platform teams internally in companies, is that like it's not a one-way interaction, right? We talk about value streams as a model, but actually like we let the developer who sits on top of the platform like PR changes in or whatever, right? Or at least like run that through some sort of service request. Yeah. And like that might impact these other teams because it changes this stupid Helm chart or something. Yeah. The reality is that like so many other things is that if you start and you're only, or like we're only thinking about the platform in terms of like the technological, like, hey, you don't like this, change the code. Actually, let's pause. Like, what's the conversation going to be? It's like the old school design is actually part of engineering. Like engineering's not just writing the code. And like, if you can save yourself from writing code by doing some extra design effort, I think it's like a similar version of that thinking, which is like, whoa, okay. So like, what are you seeing here? The platform should be providing a way. And like, I'm saying the platform, the community of human beings who sit in this stuff should be saying, hey, look, before we go like rewrite this thing because it's like, negative for you or whatever, can we talk as a group about like what the blast radius of this is? Or, hey, we actually found 3 different sort of versions of this need. And like, is there a way to change the platform to accommodate both? So like my like earlier reference to, I think about the stuff vertically is like probably flawed in this, because actually it's more like we exist in an ecosystem. And mycorrhizae are not a platform in an ecosystem for trees, right? Like they impact one another and then are in relationship with one another. It's not like the structured verticality. It's a useful metaphor, I think, for some things, but like the truth is like we're really in an ecological relationship. And so as human beings, we also have the joy of intellect and communication, so like I think in technology we so frequently like want to run everything through pipes, and that's not always a bad instinct, but there's so much that we can do through having like good, respectful, honest conversation with one another, and talking about like things that I think feel very human and maybe frightening, but like, hey, I have this need or I have this fear. Like, how many times have you like been a developer and been like, I'm actually really afraid that this is going to nuke all my work if we like do this thing, but like, I got to talk about it in very technical terms. And it's like, actually, like maybe if you showed up and you're just like, I'm really scared, like what sort of like humane response would that trigger? And so this is probably not what any like software developer or technologist wants to hear, but it's like, wait, can we find ways to like bring our humanity into the platform conversation? And will it actually improve the way that we think and design and interact with platforms? And like, obviously I think, yes, certainly not alone in this. Like, I don't know, maybe Werner Vogels would say that everything should just run through an API. I don't know. But like, I think in my experience, at least in most places, like having better conversations and building better. This is why I think sensitivity is such a huge thing to cultivate for leadership, is that like when we can stop debating and start like sensing and connecting on a human level, I think we can actually design much better technology not just the way that we think and talk about that, like in consumer applications, but all up and down the stack. And you know, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong about that, but I like am pretty convicted that like the places where I've seen the best platform interactions and the most fun and the most like joy and creativity are places that are like pretty humane, and pretty committed to like cultivating and extending humanity, not you know, abstracting it out of the conversation.
Cool. Yep. It's that socio-technical system stuff.
Yeah, man.
Spencer, it was so lovely to have you. You should come back. Maybe bring Brian next time. I thought it was a great conversation. I'm looking forward to future conversations.
Yeah, definitely, man. Me too.
Cool. For everybody out there, if you want to have some more interviews about platform engineering, meet some more people in the community, hit the subscribe button, hit that bell, and we'll see you all around. Thanks, Spencer.
Yeah, thanks, Jay. I'll talk to you guys soon.
Oh, cool.